The year was 1929, and the air along the Massachusetts coast carried both the smell of salt and the weight of uncertainty. America was already trembling on the edge of financial collapse, though few understood the scale of what was about to come. In Quincy, just south of Boston, shipbuilding had been the lifeline of countless families for generations. The yards rang with the clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, and the shouts of foremen urging their men to work harder, faster, better. Yet in the fall of that year, dozens of shipbuilders clocked in for what seemed like any other day, and by sundown, they were gone. No resignations, no farewells, no bodies. Vanished. Local newspapers covered the event briefly, speculating about labor strikes or bankrupt management, but within weeks, the headlines shifted toward Wall Street's implosion. The missing men became whispers, their families left with nothing but questions and the echo of tools that would never again strike metal. For 75 years, the story lay buried, half remembered in family folklore, and tucked into yellowed folders in forgotten archives. But history has a way of surfacing when least expected. If you love stories of forgotten mysteries and hidden truths, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next unraveling secret. In present-day Boston, Ethan Cole sat hunched over a chipped wooden desk, the newsroom around him buzzing with the speed of digital headlines. 26 years old, with restless brown eyes and a mind that refused to settle, Ethan was a reporter trying to prove he belonged in a world that valued clicks more than substance. His colleagues joked about him chasing ghosts, digging into archives when he should have been tracking political scandals or celebrity slip-ups. But Ethan didn't care. He wanted something more than recycled press releases. He wanted a story that mattered. That evening, while combing through municipal records in a quiet back room of the Boston Public Library, he stumbled upon a file that hadn't been touched in decades. The folder was thin, its paper brittle with age, stamped with the words Quincy Shipyard as closed case. Inside, a single line stood out. Underground workshop connected to missing personnel. Evidence inconclusive. Ethan froze, reading the sentence over and over. An underground workshop? No article he'd found, no dusty clipping had ever mentioned such a thing. His pulse quickened, his reporter's instincts sharpening. If there was even a chance that a hidden site existed, untouched for nearly a century, it could be the kind of story that defined a career. Yet doubt tugged at him. Why had no one uncovered this before? Why had the file been so deliberately buried? As the clock struck 9 and the library lights dimmed, Ethan packed the file into his bag, his mind buzzing with possibilities. Walking through the chilly Boston night, he thought of his father, a dock worker who'd always told him, "Every story worth telling comes with a price." Maybe this was the price. Long nights, endless skepticism, and the gnawing feeling that some truths were hidden for a reason. Back in his cramped apartment in South Boston, the hum of traffic outside mixed with the scratching of Ethan's pen as he filled pages with notes. He traced names of vanished workers, cross-referenced the dates, and circled the cryptic phrase again and again, underground workshop. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "If this place really exists," he murmured, "what else did they hide down there?" The question hung heavy in the air, as if the walls themselves knew the answer. And for the first time in his short career, Ethan felt he had stepped onto the edge of something that could either make him or break him. The ghosts of 1929 were no longer just whispers in forgotten halls. They were knocking at his door. The coastal air of Quincy in 1929 carried the clamor of hammers, the sharp tang of molten metal, and the rhythmic thud of wooden beams being set into place. It was a world defined by sweat and steel, where every ship that rose from the docks bore the fingerprints of hundreds of men. At the center of it all stood Captain Walter Briggs, a broad-shouldered foreman with a reputation for fairness. His men respected him not only for his command, but for his refusal to treat them as expendable hands. On the morning of October 17th, he called out orders as usual, his voice cutting through the roar of machinery. By sundown, he and dozens of his crew had vanished. The town never recovered from the shock. Families waited at dinner tables, wives stared at unopened doors, and children cried themselves to sleep asking where their fathers had gone. Rumors swirled. Some claimed Briggs had led a strike that went wrong. Others whispered of debts to dangerous men. Within weeks, the headlines shifted to the collapse of Wall Street, and Quincy's vanished shipbuilders slipped into obscurity, swallowed by the Great Depression. Back in the present, Ethan Cole tapped his pen against a notebook inside a quiet archive room. The old file still burned in his mind, its cryptic reference to an underground workshop gnawing at him. He had spent days tracing newspaper clippings, family registries, and labor records, piecing together a puzzle that had been ignored for nearly a century. The deeper he dug, the stranger the silences became. Determined to hear from those who still carried the echoes of the missing, Ethan drove to a modest house in Quincy's Wollaston neighborhood. The home belonged to the grandson of one of the vanished workers, a man named Paul Carver. The elderly man answered the door slowly, leaning on a cane, his sharp eyes flicking over Ethan's press badge. "You're digging where no one wants to dig," Paul muttered, after inviting him inside. The living room smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish, photographs of stern-faced ancestors lining the mantel. "I'm not here to sensationalize," Ethan explained carefully. "I want to know the truth. Your grandfather disappeared in 1929. Don't you think people deserve to know what really happened?" Paul studied him in silence before lowering himself into an armchair. "My grandmother waited for him every night until the day she died. She swore the company knew more than they admitted, but whenever she pressed, doors closed. Lawyers came around with papers she refused to sign. Money was offered, then taken away when she demanded answers. After that, no one in my family spoke about it. Too painful, too dangerous." Ethan scribbled notes, heart racing. It wasn't just a mystery. It was a wound still bleeding after generations. A few days later, Ethan arranged a meeting with a woman who might provide clarity beyond folklore. Detective Margaret Hayes, retired from the Boston Police Department, had once specialized in cold cases. She met him at a cafe near Dorchester, silver hair tied back neatly, her posture still upright with authority despite her years. "You're chasing shadows, Mr. Cole," she said, sipping black coffee. "I looked into that case back in the 70s when a relative petitioned for answers. Do you know what I found?" Ethan leaned forward eagerly. "What?" "Empty files, requests denied, records missing. I was told more than once to drop it if I valued my career, and I wasn't in the business of chasing ghosts when I had living victims who needed justice." Her words cut, but they also confirmed his suspicion. The silence was intentional. "Why tell me this now?" Ethan asked. Hayes' eyes softened, a rare crack in her hardened demeanor. "Because you're too stubborn to stop. And maybe, just maybe, someone should finish what others couldn't. But understand, if this was buried, it was buried for a reason." As Ethan walked out into the crisp Boston night, the hum of traffic mingling with the glow of streetlights, he felt both fear and determination. The past was no longer a distant story. It was alive, pressing against him, demanding to be uncovered. And the next step would lead him deeper than he imagined. Ethan's excitement after speaking with Margaret Hayes carried him through the following morning, but the newsroom quickly stripped it away. He dropped the old file on his editor's cluttered desk, eager to share what he had uncovered. The man barely glanced at it, his tie loosened and his eyes locked on the latest trending feeds. "Ethan, we don't have the time or budget for ghost stories," the editor said flatly. "The world is drowning in real news. Elections, scandals, markets. You're chasing a labor dispute from nearly a century ago." "This isn't just a labor dispute," Ethan countered, his voice rising with conviction. "Dozens of men vanished. There's a possibility of a hidden site underground, untouched since 1929. If we can prove it." His editor cut him off with a sigh. "If you want to waste your weekends, be my guest, but don't expect me to fund your wild goose chase. And don't let it distract you from the assignments I actually pay you for." Ethan clenched his jaw, collected the file, and walked out, his ears burning. He had expected resistance, but the outright dismissal stung. The newsroom around him buzzed with chatter and ringing phones, yet he felt isolated, as though everyone else had already decided he was a fool. That night, at his apartment, He vented to Claire Matthews. She sat across from him at their small kitchen table, her glasses sliding down her nose as she flipped through one of her history books. A professor at a local college, Claire had always admired Ethan's persistence, but she knew the toll it was taking. "Ethan, I'm not saying it's not fascinating," she said gently, "but you have to think about what you're sacrificing. Your job is already on the line. Do you really want to risk everything for something no one's asking you to solve?" He rubbed his temples. "That's the point, Claire. No one asked because no one dared. It was buried. Don't you see, this isn't just a story, it's the truth waiting to be uncovered." Her eyes softened, but worry lingered in her voice. "I don't want to see you throw away your future chasing ghosts. Promise me you'll think carefully." "I can't promise that," he admitted, voice low. "Because if I stop now, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The tension between them lingered long after the conversation ended, a quiet rift opening in the small apartment. Over the next week, Ethan pushed forward alone. He drained his savings on gas for endless drives to dusty archives, buying photocopies of records and paying for access to genealogy databases. His bank account shrank faster than he could ignore, and each late-night calculation of bills versus income left him with a knot in his stomach. Rent loomed like a shadow, demanding choices he didn't want to make. Worse still, he wasn't the only one watching the past. At the Quincy Historical Society, Ethan requested access to records on the shipyard. A sharply dressed lawyer named Richard Kane met him with a polite but cold smile. "These files aren't open to public review," Kane said smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks. "They contain sensitive information, and the society must protect its integrity." Ethan frowned. "Sensitive? About a shipyard that shut down nearly a century ago?" "Some histories," Kane replied, "are best left undisturbed. Pursuing them can cause unnecessary pain. I'd advise you to reconsider." The warning was clear, though wrapped in courteous language. Ethan left the building with his fists clenched, frustration boiling in his chest. Back at his apartment, he spread the scraps of information across the table. Briggs's name, the journal entry about the underground workshop, Hayes's warning, Paul Carver's story. Each fragment seemed to whisper the same thing. He was getting close. Too close, perhaps, for those who wanted silence. The obstacles stacked higher with each passing day, but the flame inside him refused to dim. If anything, every rejection, every warning, every financial sacrifice only fueled his determination. The truth was out there, and Ethan was ready to risk everything to drag it into the light. And just when the weight of doubt threatened to crush him, a discovery on an old map reignited his path. It was a grey afternoon when Ethan stumbled upon the key to everything. While sifting through more records in the basement of an old library, his hand brushed over a torn map, tucked inside a neglected folder. It wasn't much. A faded blueprint of the shipyard from 1929, drawn in thick black ink, with cryptic markings around a section labeled Restricted Access. His breath caught as his eyes traced the faded lines. The area marked on the map was beneath the shipyard, where the main structure ended and where the docks stretched toward the water. The map showed what appeared to be a series of tunnels leading off the property, but none of the public records mentioned anything like that. No local historical records, no archived police reports, not even a whisper in the local newspaper. Yet here it was, clear as day, a subterranean workshop. Ethan's heart raced. This was it, the discovery he had been waiting for. The map indicated that the tunnels might still be intact, but they were sealed off, hidden from plain view. The question now wasn't if it existed, but where it was and why it had been kept so secret. That evening, he showed the map to Detective Margaret Hayes. "Are you sure?" she asked, squinting at the map, her fingers tracing the lines. "I spent years looking for something like this, and now you find it by accident?" "I don't think it's an accident," Ethan replied, his voice thick with excitement. "It was hidden, all these years, buried in plain sight." Margaret leaned back in her chair, thinking. "If those tunnels are still there, and the workshop is where you say it is, you could be looking at something far bigger than just an old factory. This could be linked to secret government contracts, to the Navy." Ethan nodded slowly. He had read enough in the journal of Arthur Green, the shipbuilder who had worked there, to know that the shipyard had ties to some of the most sensitive projects of the time, particularly naval innovations. The kind of projects that didn't just get buried, they were erased. With a surge of determination, Ethan set his plan into motion. He contacted Sergeant Daniel Ruiz, a local officer who had worked the cold cases in Quincy before his retirement. The two men had met once years ago when Ethan had followed up on an unrelated story about a robbery in the area. Ruiz hadn't remembered him at first, but after a short conversation, the sergeant agreed to meet at the shipyard. The morning of the visit, a heavy fog clung to the ground, the city just barely visible through the mist. Ethan met Ruiz in the empty parking lot by the shipyard gates. The sergeant was older now, with grey peppering his hair, but his eyes were sharp, full of quiet authority. "You really think there's something down there?" Ruiz asked, scanning the old buildings with skepticism. "I have the map," Ethan replied, handing it over. "The workshop's real, we just need to find the entrance." Ruiz looked over the map carefully, then nodded. "All right, let's see what you've got. But if there's nothing, we're done. Understood?" They walked through the still shipyard, the quiet only broken by the distant sound of seagulls. The fog muffled their steps, creating a sense of isolation as they approached the part of the yard marked as restricted. It was a desolate area, broken windows in the warehouses, old ship parts scattered across the ground. To the casual observer, it was nothing more than a forgotten piece of land, slowly decaying under the weight of time. Yet Ethan knew what to look for. His eyes scanned the old brick walls, and as they neared the corner of a building, something caught his eye. A faint outline on the ground, partially covered by loose dirt. The ground was uneven, almost as if it had been disturbed. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Ruiz knelt, his hands brushing aside dirt and debris, revealing a metal hatch, rusted but unmistakable. The locks were old, but not enough to make it impossible to open. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. The reality of what they were about to uncover began to sink in. They weren't just about to open a door, they were about to unearth a century-old secret. With a final glance at Ruiz, Ethan crouched down and with some effort pried open the hatch. The door creaked as it gave way, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "This is where it starts," Ethan muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Ruiz stared into the blackness below, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure you want to go down there?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. The weight of the decision, the unknowns, the danger, it was all too real. But the chance to uncover the truth, to expose what had been hidden for so long, pushed him forward. "Yes," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I'm sure." As the metal hatch creaked open, a musty smell of old stone and forgotten years wafted out, lingering in the cold morning air. Ethan stood at the top of the narrow staircase, heart pounding in his chest. The dim light from above barely illuminated the descending steps, and the silence below seemed to beckon him forward. Beside him, Sergeant Ruiz adjusted his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. "This is it," Ethan whispered, his voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. Ruiz gave him a pointed look, the weight of the situation not lost on him. "You sure about this, kid? Once we go down, there's no turning back." Ethan hesitated for only a moment. He had already come so far, piecing together a history no one else seemed interested in. This was more than just an investigation now. It had become personal. The shipyard workers, their families, his entire life had been defined by stories of people erased from history, and now he had the chance to give them a voice. He couldn't back down. "I have to," Ethan replied, his tone steady. "This is the truth we've been denied for 75 years. I can't walk away now." The sergeant gave a curt nod, his skepticism replaced by a reluctant respect. With a deep breath, Ethan took the first step down the staircase. The air grew colder the farther they descended, and the faint scent of oil and rust filled his nose. Each step seemed to stretch the silence, the only sound their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The tunnel beneath the shipyard was nothing like Ethan had imagined. It was expansive, larger than he had expected, with beams and old machinery scattered about like a forgotten workshop suspended in time. At the bottom of the stairs, the ground leveled off into an open space. A large concrete floor stretched before them, with old shipbuilding tools scattered like forgotten relics of a past life. In the dim light of their flashlights, rusted gears and half-assembled ship parts seemed to stand frozen, caught in the act of creation. It was as if the workers had been pulled away mid-task, their tools left behind, abandoned. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, his breath catching as he took in the magnitude of it. But there was something else, something that made his stomach twist with unease. The walls of the workshop were covered in strange markings, symbols he couldn't recognize. His flashlight caught something written on the far wall, coordinates almost like a map, but not of the shipyard. It was as if they were marking points for something larger, something even more secret. "This is it," Ethan murmured. This was the workshop, hidden beneath everything. Ruiz stepped forward, casting a wary eye over the room. "I don't like it," he muttered, his voice low. "This place, it doesn't feel right, like something was meant to stay buried." Ethan turned toward him. "It was meant to stay buried. That's why they hid it, Sergeant. This place wasn't just about shipbuilding, it was about something more. Something they didn't want anyone to know." Suddenly, the beam of Ruiz's flashlight caught something on the floor, a journal half buried beneath a pile of rusted metal parts. Ethan's pulse quickened as he crouched down to retrieve it. It was old, the leather cover cracked with age, but the pages inside were intact. He flipped it open carefully, scanning the words. The handwriting was messy, hurried. It belonged to Arthur Green, the shipbuilder whose journal Ethan had seen in the archives. The entry was dated October 1929, the last entry before the men disappeared. Green's words were frantic. "They told us it was just a new project, a new contract. But I know better now. This isn't just about ships, it's about something bigger. Something they want to keep hidden at all costs. The Navy has its claws in this, and if they find out what we're building, it could change everything. I don't know who to trust anymore. The men are getting nervous. They don't know why we're working on things we don't understand." Ethan's hands trembled as he read. This was it. This was the confirmation he needed. They hadn't just disappeared. Something had been done to keep them silent. Ruiz watched him carefully, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't just a shipyard, is it? This was a front." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of the discovery settling in. They were building something for the Navy, something they didn't want anyone to know about. That's why they vanished. That's why they shut it down. They didn't want anyone to find out what was really going on down here. The silence in the room seemed to deepen, pressing in on them from all sides. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Ethan's heart raced. He had come so far he couldn't stop now, not with this kind of evidence. But as he turned to speak, a sound echoed through the workshop. A footstep, distant but unmistakable. Someone else was down here. The distant footstep echoed through the underground workshop, breaking the tense silence that had settled over Ethan and Ruiz. Both men froze, their breath caught in their throats. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. Someone else was here in the dark, hidden depths of this forgotten place. Ethan's heart raced as he scanned the room, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. His flashlight trembled in his hand, casting long shadows on the rusted shipbuilding equipment that littered the floor. The journal he'd just found felt heavier in his grasp, its significance growing with every second. "Did you hear that?" Ruiz whispered, his voice low and steady, though there was a flicker of tension in his eyes. "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice barely above a murmur. He turned slowly, checking the narrow corridor behind them. "Stay close. We don't know who else might be down here." They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust and debris on the floor. Each creak of the old wooden beams above them seemed to amplify the silence, making every small sound feel amplified, like an unseen presence watching them from the shadows. The further they ventured into the workshop, the more it felt like they were intruding on something they weren't meant to see. It was an eerie, almost oppressive atmosphere, like the space had been frozen in time, with remnants of unfinished work scattered about, as though the shipbuilders had been suddenly pulled away. As they moved deeper into the room, Ethan's flashlight swept across a large rusted metal door at the far end. It was partially ajar, a sliver of darkness peering through. His pulse quickened. This had to be it, the heart of the workshop, the place where the most secretive work had taken place. Without speaking, he gestured to Ruiz, who nodded in understanding. They approached the door cautiously, their steps synchronized. The air grew colder as they drew nearer, the faint smell of oil and old machinery thickening around them. Ethan reached for the door handle, but just as his fingers brushed against the metal, another sound cut through the stillness. This time it was louder, a scraping noise, followed by a faint shuffle. Someone was moving on the other side of the door. Ruiz grabbed his arm. "Stay back," he whispered urgently, pulling him away from the door. His grip was firm, his instincts taking over. "We don't know who that is. Could be someone who's been hiding down here all these years. Or worse, someone connected to whatever happened to those men." Ethan's mind raced. He had come so far, uncovered so much. Was it too late to turn back now? He wasn't ready to give up, not after everything he had learned. But Ruiz was right. They had no idea what they were walking into. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped back, nodding reluctantly. "Let's call for backup. We need to make sure this is handled the right way." "No more risks." They retreated to the main staircase, the sound of the scraping growing faint as they moved away. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they had just uncovered, it wasn't just a forgotten part of the shipyard. It was something far bigger, something dangerous. Once outside, they quickly made their way back to the surface. The daylight hit them with a harsh clarity, and Ethan felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. His mind raced with questions. Who else knew about the workshop? Why had someone been down there? And most importantly, who was willing to go to such lengths to keep the secrets of the shipyard buried? Ethan pulled out his phone, dialing the number for Detective Hayes. The call rang once, then twice. When she finally picked up, her voice was filled with concern. "Ethan, what's going on?" "We've found it," he said, his voice urgent. "The workshop. But someone's down there. We need to talk. This is bigger than we thought." There was a pause on the other end, and then Hayes replied, her voice firm. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't do anything until I arrive." "Do you understand?" Ethan looked over at Ruiz, who gave him a reassuring nod. "We understand." As he hung up the phone, Ethan's thoughts swirled. The discovery of the hidden workshop had been only the beginning. There were still so many pieces to the puzzle left to uncover. And with someone else down there watching them, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something that would change everything they thought they knew about the shipyard and its dark history. Ethan paced nervously in the parking lot, the wind biting through his jacket. The faint hum of the city echoed in the distance, but here in the shadow of the old shipyard, it felt like the world had forgotten about them. He glanced at his phone, checking the time. Detective Hayes should have been here by now. His breath clouded in the cool air, his anxiety building as he replayed the events of the last hour in his mind. The workshop, the journal, the mysterious presence that had been lurking in the dark. It was all too much, too fast, and as the minutes ticked by, Ethan felt the weight of his decisions pressing harder against his chest. What if they were too late? What if the truth they were chasing had already been buried again, this time for good? Finally, the sound of tires on gravel broke his thoughts. Detective Hayes pulled up in an unmarked car, the headlights briefly illuminating the dim lot. She stepped out, her expression unreadable. As she approached, Ethan could see the hardened determination in her eyes, the same fire that had driven her all those years ago when she had worked the cold cases. "You're sure no one else is down there?" Hayes asked, her voice low but firm. There was no room for doubt in her words. "We didn't see anyone else, but someone was there," Ethan replied, glancing over at Ruiz, who was standing by the entrance, scanning the surroundings. "It sounded like they were moving around, but we couldn't get a good look." Hayes nodded, eyes narrowing. "All right, let's not waste time. If there's a chance that someone's still down there, we need to find them before they vanish again." The three of them moved quickly toward the entrance, the harsh light from the car fading as they descended into the depths of the workshop. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of rust and decay. As they approached the door, the same eerie silence from before enveloped them. "This is where we found it," Ethan whispered, his voice almost lost in the stillness. The door loomed ahead, the narrow gap where they had last seen the shadow still open. Ethan stepped forward, his pulse quickening. He felt the weight of the moment, of all the years of hidden history, of workers who had vanished, of lives erased. This was the point of no return. Hayes motioned for Ruiz to take the lead. He hesitated, his hand resting on his flashlight. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "Ready," Hayes replied, her voice unwavering. Ruiz pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the dark room ahead, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Ethan's breath caught as he stepped inside, eyes darting around. There was no movement, no sign of life. But the feeling of being watched lingered, pressing against his skin like a constant weight. They moved cautiously through the room, the sound of their footsteps the only noise breaking the silence. The workshop looked the same as it had when they'd left, disorganized, abandoned, frozen in time. But something was different now. The air felt heavier, as if it carried the secrets of the place more clearly than before. The faint hum of electricity buzzed in the background, a reminder that this was not just a forgotten space. It was a carefully maintained relic, something meant to be hidden even if it was forgotten. Ethan's eyes locked on a new detail, an overturned chair, its legs pointing toward a small desk at the far end of the room. He approached it, his mind racing. Something wasn't right. The room was still, but the chair, it had been disturbed. It was the first sign of movement they had found in hours. "Someone's been here," he murmured, bending down to inspect it. Hayes and Ruiz exchanged a glance. Then from the corner of the room a faint creak echoed through the space. It was subtle, but it was enough. Someone was here, and they weren't alone anymore. Ethan's breath hitched in his chest as he stood up. His pulse was pounding now, his heart thudding in his ears. They were so close to the truth. But with each step deeper into the darkness, he realized something else. Whoever was watching them was not going to let them uncover it without a fight. "You know what to do," Hayes said, her voice sharp now. "We need to find out who's behind this before it's too late." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. There was no turning back. They had found the heart of the mystery, but now the danger was real. The truth was closer than ever, but so was the threat of everything being buried once again. The air in the workshop felt thicker now, as if the very walls were pressing in on them. Ethan stood at the center of the room, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Each shadow seemed to stretch toward him, pulling his focus toward the darkest corners. The creak from earlier, the sound that had unsettled him so much, had faded, but it lingered in his mind, echoing like a warning. They weren't alone. Beside him, Detective Hayes's voice cut through the tension. "We're not just dealing with a hidden workshop, Ethan. This is bigger, much bigger." Ethan turned to face her, the gravity of her words settling in. He had known they were on the edge of something significant, but now he was starting to realize just how far the reach of this mystery extended. The journal he'd found, the strange markings on the walls, and now the unknown presence in the workshop. It was all part of a larger, hidden agenda. "What do you mean, bigger?" he asked, his voice tight. Hayes stepped closer, her eyes scanning the walls, the faint light catching the edges of old blueprints pinned haphazardly to the crumbling surface. "These aren't just shipbuilders we're talking about. This place, this workshop, it was a front for something far more dangerous. These men weren't just building boats, they were working on military contracts, classified projects. The Navy was involved, and I suspect there's more." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. It made sense now, the secrecy, the cover-ups. The workers hadn't just vanished because of a financial collapse or a labor dispute. They had disappeared because they were involved in something that could never be made public. "Could the workers have known too much?" Ethan asked, trying to piece together the implications. "Exactly," Hayes replied. "They were building prototypes, new technology, maybe even weapons, things that, if exposed, would have changed the course of history. They weren't just disappearing, they were being erased." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of the truth settling heavy on his shoulders. The workers hadn't just been casualties of a failing business. They had been victims of a much darker game. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The government had the power to bury anything. If they didn't want the truth to get out, they had the means to ensure no one ever spoke of it again. "We need to follow the money," Hayes continued, as though reading his thoughts. "There must be a paper trail, something that ties the shipyard to military contracts. I've seen it before, government hush money, blacklisted companies. There's a thread here, and we need to pull it." Ethan nodded, the resolve growing inside him. He wasn't just investigating the past anymore, he was uncovering a conspiracy that stretched from the darkest corners of history into the present. The truth was buried beneath layers of lies, and he was determined to uncover it. "There must be records at the Navy's archives," he said, more to himself than to Hayes. "We can trace the contracts, find out what they were working on." Hayes hesitated, her eyes scanning the workshop once more. "You're right, but we'll need to be careful. If we go down that road, there's no turning back. We'll be digging into classified territory, and I don't know who else is out there watching us." Ethan's thoughts raced. Who else might be involved in this cover-up? Who had been protecting these secrets for decades? The more he uncovered, the more questions he had, and the more dangerous this investigation became. He could feel the walls closing in around him, but there was no turning back now. This was bigger than him. It was bigger than anyone who had come before him. Just as he turned to share his thoughts with Hayes, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway behind them, sharp and sudden. Ethan froze. There was no mistaking the sound. It was too deliberate, too calculated. Someone was here, and they weren't hiding in the shadows anymore. They were coming for them. Without warning, the door to the workshop slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. The faint glow of their flashlights cast eerie shapes across the walls, but they could no longer see each other clearly. "Get down!" Hayes shouted, her voice urgent, commanding. She pushed Ethan to the ground as a flash of movement cut through the room. Everything around them seemed to hold its breath. They were no longer chasing the past. They were caught in the present in a deadly game of cat and mouse, and Ethan realized, with a sinking feeling, that whoever had been hiding in the shadows was ready to ensure that the secrets of the shipyard stayed buried forever. The darkness swallowed them whole. The moment the door slammed shut, the room became a suffocating void. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest as he lay flat on the cold concrete floor. He could hear his pulse, feel the weight of the silence around him thick with tension. Hayes's hand gripped his arm, pulling him deeper into the shadows. "Stay down," she whispered urgently. "Don't move." Ethan could barely make out her silhouette beside him, the faint light from their flashlights flickering in the dark. His mind raced. Who was out there? What did they want? Had they been followed? And why had the door slammed shut with such force? Every muscle in his body was taut, coiled in anticipation. It felt like they were being hunted, like the secrets of the shipyard were not just buried in the past, but actively hunting them down, unwilling to let go. The darkness pressed in around them, as if it was alive, breathing in the space between their breaths. "Stay quiet," Hayes repeated, her voice low but firm. She wasn't afraid. Ethan could hear it in her tone. This wasn't her first time in a dangerous situation, but for Ethan this was uncharted territory, a terrifying realization that the answers he had been chasing had a cost, one he might not be ready to pay. A distant noise, the sound of something scraping along the floor, pulled him back to reality. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone was moving toward them, methodically, carefully. Ethan's muscles locked in place, his body trembling as he strained to hear every sound. His flashlight lay forgotten in the corner, its faint glow now useless in the overwhelming darkness. The noise grew louder, closer, and then stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the distant hum of the machinery they had passed earlier. Then a voice, low and gravelly, cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have come back." Ethan's blood ran cold. The voice was unfamiliar, but the malice in it was clear. Whoever this was, they knew they weren't supposed to be here. They knew what Ethan was after, and they were not about to let him walk away with it. Hayes shifted beside him, barely making a sound. She was a professional, Ethan realized in that moment, someone who had faced danger head-on more times than he could count. Yet even she couldn't mask the tension in her posture. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady, but her grip on her weapon tightening. "What do you want?" There was a moment of silence, and then a soft chuckle, dark and chilling, filled the room. It wasn't a laugh of humor, but of someone who knew the game was already lost. Ethan's throat tightened. "You should have stopped asking questions," the voice said, coming closer still. "This place was never meant to be found. The men who built this, they knew the price. But you're too far gone. The truth isn't worth your life." Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. The threat was clear, and it wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. The cost of digging into this history, of trying to uncover the truth, was more than just losing his job or reputation. It could cost him everything. Hayes didn't flinch. "We're not leaving without answers. You can't stop us." The voice laughed again, low and unsettling. "You think you can handle the truth? You don't even know what you've gotten yourselves into." Ethan felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. They weren't just fighting to uncover a hidden history. They were up against something much more dangerous, something willing to go to any lengths to keep its secrets locked away. They weren't just exposing the past. They were stepping into a conspiracy that had been alive for decades, its roots deep in the darkest corners of government and power. "Get up," Hayes whispered to Ethan, her hand guiding him to his feet. "We need to move, now." Without another word, they began to slowly move toward the far side of the room. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that every step they took was being calculated. The fear that had been building inside him surged, but there was something else too: determination. He wasn't going to let fear stop him now. As they moved deeper into the shadows, the voice faded, but its threat lingered heavy in the air. Whoever this was, they weren't finished yet. And as much as Ethan wanted to believe he was closer to the truth than ever, a sinking feeling in his gut told him that the real danger was just beginning. The weight of silence pressed in around them as they slowly made their way through the darkness. Every creak of the old wooden beams overhead felt like an accusation. The unknown voice that had threatened them lingered in Ethan's mind, the words twisting his stomach into knots. "You don't even know what you've gotten yourselves into." The message was clear. Whatever lay hidden in this place was more dangerous than he had imagined. They didn't speak as they moved, each step calculated, as if they were trying not to disturb the very air that surrounded them. Ethan's heart raced, his thoughts running wild. Who had been down here? And why had they been so certain that they couldn't let Ethan or Hayes walk out with their findings? Ethan's mind shifted back to the journal, the words he had read so many times over, the frantic plea from Arthur Green. This isn't just about ships, it's about something bigger. The journal had been his first clue that this was no ordinary shipyard, but the more he learned, the more it became clear. This was something far more sinister, and the people protecting this secret were willing to do anything to keep it that way. Hayes moved ahead of him, her every step sure and purposeful. Despite the tension in the air, she didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She was a woman accustomed to danger, and that gave Ethan the slightest bit of comfort, even as the pit in his stomach grew deeper. He trusted Hayes, but there was something that had been gnawing at him for days, a feeling, a gut instinct, that something wasn't right. They reached the door to the outside, the faintest sliver of daylight visible through the cracks. Just as Hayes reached for the handle, a sudden, sharp noise echoed from the far side of the room. A loud crash followed by a hurried shuffle. Ethan spun around, his pulse racing once again. "Stay down," Hayes murmured, her voice a mere whisper, yet filled with steel. She grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him into the nearest shadow, her grip tight. They waited, holding their breath. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, came closer. They were no longer alone. Ethan's thoughts raced. Had they been followed? Was someone else still in the workshop? The footsteps stopped just inches away from where they were hiding. Ethan's eyes locked onto Hayes's, and in that brief moment he saw it, something that made his heart drop. She wasn't just protecting him, she was protecting something more. Then it clicked. Hayes was hiding something. He didn't know what it was, but the look in her eyes, the way she was acting, it wasn't just about the investigation. It was personal. and that realization hit him like a freight train. As the footsteps moved further down the hallway, Hayes made her move. She slowly pulled away from the shadow and motioned for Ethan to follow. "Let's go," she said, her voice barely audible. Ethan hesitated but followed, his mind a whirlwind of questions. The door opened slowly, the faint light from the outside world spilling into the dark corridor. The sound of the outside world, the city's distant hum, felt like a lifeline. They stepped into the cold air, the oppressive weight of the workshop behind them. Once they were outside, Ethan couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why did you hesitate?" he demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "You knew something was off, didn't you?" Hayes stopped in her tracks and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes hard. "What are you implying?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I'm not stupid, Hayes," Ethan shot back, his breath coming fast. "You've been hiding something from me. From the start, you've been holding back. Why?" Hayes took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. The anger in her eyes softened, replaced by a weary resignation. "You don't understand, Ethan," she said quietly. "This isn't just about the shipyard. It's not just about the men who disappeared. There are forces at play here, things that go far beyond what you think you know. I didn't want you to get caught up in it. I didn't want you to be another casualty of something bigger than both of us." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "Then tell me, what is it? What aren't you telling me?" She looked away, her jaw clenched. For a long moment, she didn't speak. And when she finally did, her words were heavy, filled with an emotion that Ethan couldn't quite place. "I was part of this, Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was involved in covering it up. I thought I could stop it. I thought I could keep you out of it, but I can't anymore." The truth hung in the air between them like a suffocating fog. Everything that had led them to this moment, the mystery, the danger, the secrecy, was connected in ways Ethan hadn't imagined. Hayes wasn't just an ally. She was part of the very system that had buried the truth all these years. And now, the weight of that betrayal settled on Ethan's shoulders like a leaden cloak. Ethan's mind was reeling, his thoughts tangled in a web of questions and revelations. Hayes's confession had struck him like a blow to the gut. She wasn't just the determined detective he'd come to rely on. She was part of the very system that had buried the truth. Her hesitation, her secrecy, had all made sense now, but it didn't make it easier to accept. As they stood in the cold, the city's distant hum barely reaching them, the weight of everything they had uncovered pressed in. They were no longer just investigating a cold case. They were inside a conspiracy that stretched far beyond a single shipyard, beyond the lives of a few missing workers. They were up against something bigger, and Ethan didn't know if he was ready for it. "I need to know everything, Hayes," Ethan said, his voice low, the urgency in his words clear. "Everything. You can't just drop a bombshell like that and expect me to walk away. You owe me that much." Hayes looked at him, her expression a mix of guilt and resolve. She ran a hand through her hair, looking away for a moment before meeting his eyes again. "I never wanted you to get involved in this, Ethan. You think it was just about the shipbuilders. No, this goes all the way to the top. It was about power, about controlling technology that could change the world. The government didn't just shut down the shipyard. They made sure no one ever remembered what happened there. And I was part of that. But I can't do it anymore. I can't keep protecting them." Ethan felt a sharp pang in his chest. Betrayal. It was the only word that seemed to fit. Hayes hadn't just been withholding information. She'd been actively involved in keeping the truth from him. He'd trusted her, believed that they were partners in this investigation, but now he wasn't sure where the truth ended and the lies began. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice trembling with frustration. "If you knew all of this, why keep me in the dark? Why put me in danger?" Hayes's face softened, but the guilt remained. "Because I didn't want you to end up like them. The men who worked there, they vanished for a reason. People like me, people who knew too much, got pulled into this web. I thought I could make it right, thought I could change things without dragging anyone else into it. But now it's too late. You've seen too much. And you're in this whether you like it or not." The air between them was thick with tension, the truth slowly sinking in. Ethan realized that there was no turning back. This wasn't just about uncovering the past anymore. It was about confronting the present, about exposing the corruption and power that had kept this story buried for so long. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to push aside the anger and confusion that clouded his mind. He needed to focus. He had come too far to back down now. "So what now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "How do we fix this?" Hayes's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Ethan saw the full weight of the burden she had been carrying. "We need to follow the money," she said, her voice low. "There's a paper trail, I'm sure of it. We can trace the contracts, find out who authorized the work being done. It's all there. But we'll have to go through channels they thought were buried, and we'll need to be careful. This isn't just about exposing the shipyard anymore. It's about taking down a system that's been in place for decades." Ethan nodded, determination replacing the doubt in his chest. This wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was going to be harder than anything he'd ever faced. But the truth was worth it. The men who had vanished deserved that much. He owed it to them and to himself to see this through. "Where do we start?" he asked, his voice resolute. Hayes looked around, her eyes scanning their surroundings. The world felt different now, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. But she was right. The case wasn't just a relic of the past. It was alive, and it was dangerous. "We start with the government records," she said, her eyes sharp. "The contracts they kept hidden. We find those, and we'll find the people who made sure this whole thing stayed buried." Ethan felt a surge of energy, of purpose. It wasn't just about the shipyard anymore. It was about fighting back against everything that had been hidden, everything that had been wronged. He was ready. "I'm with you," he said. "Let's finish this." With that, they turned away from the shadows, from the weight of the secrets they had uncovered. The road ahead would be difficult, maybe impossible, but it was the only road that mattered now. There would be no more hiding, no more buried truths. They would take this to the end, to... The next morning, Ethan found himself in the same sterile, dimly lit office that had felt so familiar in the past. Except now, everything had changed. The newsroom was buzzing with activity, the sound of keyboards clicking and phones ringing filling the space, but Ethan couldn't focus on any of it. His mind was a storm of fragmented thoughts, racing between the facts he'd uncovered, Hayes's confession and the new reality he faced. The truth they were chasing was much larger than a hidden workshop or a few missing shipbuilders. It was about a system of power, a network of secrets so deeply embedded in the government that uncovering it could unravel more than just the shipyard mystery. It could shake the foundations of the system itself. And Ethan was at the center of it. He sat at his desk, staring at the blank screen in front of him. His hands hovered over the keys, unsure of where to start. He could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. The case wasn't just a story anymore. It was his story, and if he pursued it, if he exposed the truth, there was no telling how far it would go. He had to follow the money. Hayes had been right. There were records, contracts, and a trail of lies that could lead him to the heart of the conspiracy. But the risks were staggering. If he went through official channels, he knew the backlash would be immediate and brutal. He would be branded a pariah. His career, his life as he knew it, would be over. There were people watching, people who would do anything to protect what had been hidden for so long. The thought of it sent a cold shiver down his spine. The magnitude of what he was about to do was finally hitting him. This wasn't just about digging into the past. It was about exposing a system that had been carefully constructed to protect itself at all costs, and it wasn't going to give up without a fight. Ethan's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Hayes. "We need to move fast. I found something." His pulse quickened. This was it, the break they'd been waiting for. Ethan grabbed his coat and headed out of the office, determination taking hold of him. The game had changed, but so had he. There was no turning back. A few hours later, Ethan stood outside the archives of the National Navy Records in Washington, D.C. It felt surreal, standing in front of the building that housed some of the most sensitive documents in the country. This was the place where the truth could be uncovered or buried for good. He had come here with one goal, to find the contracts that linked the shipyard to the government. He needed the proof to break the story wide open. Ethan had never been this nervous in his life. The weight of the information he was about to expose could destroy everything, but it wasn't just about him. It was about the families who had been robbed of their loved ones, the workers who had disappeared without a trace. The truth had to come out. He stepped into the building, the air inside cool and sterile. The smell of old paper and leather filled his nostrils, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound. He made his way to the records room, where a security guard checked his identification before granting him access. Ethan swallowed, trying to keep his composure. This was the moment. The records room was vast, rows upon rows of files stretching far beyond what he could see. He approached the desk, where an archivist greeted him with a polite smile. "How can I assist you today, sir?" "I'm looking for records related to military contracts involving the Quincy shipyard from 1929, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "Specifically, anything that ties them to the Navy or classified projects." The archivist raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. "I'll need to pull some files. Please take a seat." "It may take a while." Ethan nodded and sat down, his eyes scanning the room. He had no idea what kind of resistance he would face here, but one thing was certain. This was a pivotal moment. The files would either confirm everything Hayes had said or expose her as part of a much larger conspiracy. Either way, he would know the truth. As the archivist disappeared behind a set of shelves, Ethan's mind raced. Would the government's records provide the smoking gun, or would they be hidden, erased, just like the shipbuilders themselves? The wait seemed endless. Ethan's thoughts were consumed by the enormity of what he was about to discover. The outcome of this moment would affect more than just his career. It would affect the future, the way people viewed their history and the way power worked in the world. Finally, the archivist returned with a stack of documents, placing them on the desk in front of Ethan. "Here you go," the archivist said, nodding before walking away. Ethan glanced down at the files. He didn't need to open them to know that this was the moment that would define everything. His hands shook as he reached for the first file, the air around him heavy with anticipation. Ethan's fingers trembled as he carefully pulled the first file toward him. The papers inside were old, yellowed at the edges, with a slight musty smell that made them feel both ancient and somehow forbidden. He adjusted the reading glasses that he hadn't needed a moment ago, but the gravity of the situation demanded his full attention. The file was marked with a stamp he hadn't seen before: Top Secret, Navy Contract 72789. Ethan's pulse quickened as he opened it, knowing he was holding the key to everything: the truth, the missing workers, the shipyard's role in it all. The first page was a government letter, dated 1930, just a year after the disappearance of the shipbuilders. The letter outlined a military contract with the Quincy shipyard, a deal involving the construction of new naval technologies, specifically designs for experimental submarines. There were mentions of prototypes being built underground, hidden from public view, away from prying eyes. Ethan's mind raced as he read further. The letter mentioned an agreement to suspend public knowledge of the project, citing national security, a clear attempt to control not only the information, but the narrative surrounding the shipyard. The piece that made his breath catch in his throat, though, was the last line of the letter. In case of public disclosure, all associated personnel must be considered compromised and removed from public knowledge. His stomach twisted. Compromised and removed from public knowledge. That could mean only one thing. Those workers hadn't just vanished. They had been erased, their existence swept away to protect something far more valuable. The room seemed to close in on him. The implications of what he had just read were staggering. The workers hadn't been the victims of a simple accident or some financial collapse. They had been silenced because they knew too much about a military project that even now could have far-reaching consequences. This wasn't just a conspiracy about a shipyard. It was a conspiracy about power, about the manipulation of information, and about a government willing to sacrifice its citizens for the sake of control. Ethan's eyes flicked over to the next page, where a list of names was typed in neat rows, names of shipyard workers who had been assigned to the project. A few of the names were familiar from the records he had dug through earlier. But several were new, men whose families had never received compensation, never had a reason to think their loved ones had been involved in anything other than a mundane job. One name, though, stopped him cold. Arthur Green, the name he had seen in the journal. The name of the foreman who had kept the secret, whose final entry in the journal had hinted at a betrayal. Ethan stared at the page for a long moment, the weight of it settling deep in his chest. Arthur Green hadn't just been a shipbuilder. He had been part of something much bigger, something that had cost him everything. As his mind began to process the enormity of what he had uncovered, he was interrupted by the sound of a chair scraping across the floor. Ethan looked up to see the archivist standing in the doorway, his face a neutral mask. "I see you've found what you were looking for," the archivist said, his voice calm, but there was a glint of something dangerous in his eyes. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had been so consumed by the documents in front of him that he hadn't heard anyone approaching, and now, standing before him, was someone who knew too much about the documents, about the secrets they held. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but the words felt hollow, as if he were already in too deep. The archivist's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just someone who makes sure things stay quiet. No one's supposed to be digging into these files, Mr. Cole, especially not you." Ethan's mind raced. This was it, the moment when everything he'd uncovered could be ripped away from him, buried again in the shadow of power. But there was no going back now. He couldn't unsee what he had just read, couldn't ignore the truth anymore. "Do you think this will just go away?" Ethan demanded, standing up from the desk, his voice sharp. "You're trying to hide history, to erase the lives of those men, but it's all here. The truth is here, and I'm not going to stop." The archivist's eyes darkened. "You should have stayed in the dark. Now you're part of the problem." Ethan felt a chill creep down his spine. He didn't know who this man worked for, but it was clear he wasn't alone in his efforts to keep the shipyard's secrets buried. They would fight to the end to protect what they had hidden, but so would Ethan. The truth was too important to ignore. "I'm not scared of you," Ethan said, his voice low but filled with resolve. The archivist stepped back, his gaze still fixed on Ethan. "We'll see how long that lasts." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Ethan alone with the evidence that could change everything. Ethan stood in the sterile, quiet room, the weight of the documents before him pressing on his chest like an invisible hand. His hands shook as he placed the file back on the desk. His head spun with the realization of how deep the conspiracy ran. The very air felt thick with secrets, secrets that had been buried for decades, and now he was holding the shovel to unearth them. He knew this moment was pivotal. The files were undeniable proof that the shipyard had been a front for something much bigger, something darker than he had ever imagined. Experimental military projects, prototypes built in secrecy, workers erased from history. Every page he turned confirmed that the government had been involved, hiding the truth, silencing those who could expose it. The workers had not simply vanished, they were removed, their lives and their families erased to protect the agenda of the powerful. Ethan glanced at the door. The archivist's ominous warning still echoed in his mind. "You should have stayed in the dark." It was clear now that there were people, powerful people, who would do anything to prevent this information from being revealed. His heart hammered in his chest. If he continued, if he exposed what he had learned, there was no turning back. His life would change in ways he couldn't yet understand. They would come after him, just as they had after the shipbuilders. The question now wasn't whether he was ready for the consequences, but whether the truth was worth the price. As Ethan stood there, the weight of the decision pulling at him, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Hayes. "We need to meet. It's urgent." His mind raced. Whatever this was, it had to be important. He quickly grabbed the files, tucking them into his bag, his thoughts clouded with urgency. As much as he wanted to take a moment to process everything, he knew there was no time. The people behind this were already moving, already aware of the danger Ethan and Hayes posed. He couldn't afford to waste another minute. Ethan left the archive, his footsteps quick but cautious. The cool air of Washington, D.C. greeted him as he stepped outside, the distant hum of the city filling his ears. He could feel the eyes on him, even if he couldn't see them. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide another set of eyes, watching, waiting for him to slip up. And as he headed for his car, the same gnawing feeling that had been growing inside him since the first day of the investigation intensified. There was something more to this, something deeper, and he was dangerously close to uncovering it. The drive to the meeting place was a blur. Ethan's thoughts drifted between what he had learned and what was still unknown. Hayes had been a part of the cover-up, yes, but her recent actions, the way she had guided him through the investigation, suggested that she wasn't fully complicit. She wanted to bring the truth to light too, but the cost was clear. They were playing with fire, and the closer they got to the heart of the conspiracy, the more dangerous their pursuit would become. As he parked near their usual meeting spot, Ethan's phone buzzed again. It was another message from Hayes. "I'm here. Don't take too long." His grip tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't need to be told twice. With a deep breath, he grabbed the files from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, making his way toward the alley where Hayes was waiting. The night air was colder than usual, a chill that seeped into his bones, reminding him of the danger they were in. When he reached the corner, Hayes was already there, standing under the dim glow of a streetlight. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in her posture that Ethan could sense even from a distance. Something had changed in her, something he couldn't quite place. She wasn't just an ally anymore. She was a person burdened by a past that had caught up with her, a past that it seemed was now threatening to swallow them both whole. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, walking toward her, his voice low. Hayes didn't immediately answer. She glanced around as if checking for anyone who might be watching. When she spoke, her voice was low, edged with something dangerous. "There's more to this than I told you, Ethan. There are people in higher places, people who have been protecting this secret for decades, and they won't stop until it's buried for good." Ethan felt the weight of her words. He had known there would be danger, but now it felt more real than ever. It wasn't just about exposing the shipyard anymore. It was about uncovering a power that had been working from the shadows, a system of control that had been in place long before either of them had come into the picture. "Then we need to move fast," Ethan said, his resolve hardening. "We can't let them bury this again." Hayes nodded slowly, her eyes hardening. "No. We expose them no matter the cost." The cold wind whipped through the alley as Ethan stood across from Hayes, both of them quiet for a moment, taking in the weight of what lay ahead. The threat was undeniable now. They weren't just digging into the past, they were uncovering a truth that could change everything. Yet even with all the evidence they had, the price of revealing it still lingered in the air between them. The stakes had never been higher. Ethan's hands tightened around the stack of files in his bag. He had the documents, evidence that connected the shipyard, the vanished workers, and the government conspiracy. What he didn't have was the certainty of safety. The deeper they went, the more dangerous the game became. They weren't just exposing a hidden history, they were challenging a system that had been in place for decades, one built on secrecy and silence. "Are we ready for this?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice steady, but the tremor of doubt was there. It wasn't fear, at least not just fear. It was the realization that what they were about to do couldn't be undone. Once they exposed the truth, there would be no going back. Hayes didn't answer right away. She stood with her arms crossed, staring into the distance, her face set in a hard line. "We're not ready for anything, Ethan," she said, her voice low but firm. "But we don't have a choice anymore. This has been buried long enough." Her words carried a weight that felt too heavy to bear. Ethan had known the consequences from the moment he started this investigation, but now that he was standing on the edge of it, the truth felt like both a weapon and a burden. "I've never been ready for any of this," Ethan said almost to himself, "but now I know why I had to do it. Those men, those families, they deserve to be remembered. They deserve justice." Hayes nodded slowly, her gaze sharp as she looked at him. "And we owe it to them, Ethan, to everyone who's been silenced. We owe it to them to make sure their voices are heard, no matter the cost." The weight of those words settled deep in Ethan's chest. He had started this investigation as a journalist looking for a story, But somewhere along the way, it had become something much bigger. The shipbuilders, the disappeared workers, the families who had been left behind. It wasn't just about uncovering a dark chapter in history. It was about exposing a system that had robbed them of their lives, their dignity, and their memories. The truth wasn't just something to be uncovered, it was something to be fought for. "Then let's finish this," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "Let's take this to the world." Hayes's expression softened for just a moment, a flicker of something akin to respect in her eyes. "You've got guts, Cole, I'll give you that. Let's make sure we don't lose everything trying to expose it, though." Ethan didn't respond, but he understood. Hayes was right. The road ahead was perilous, and the people behind the conspiracy wouldn't go down without a fight. But this was the moment of no return. They had the evidence, they had the truth. All they had to do was make sure it reached the light of day. The two of them stood together in the cold, the weight of their mission settling over them. They weren't just fighting for the workers who had disappeared. They were fighting for a world that hadn't yet learned how far people would go to protect their secrets. And if they were going to survive this, they would have to face it head-on. "I've got the press release drafted," Hayes said after a moment. "All we need is to get the story out." Ethan nodded. It was time to bring the truth into the open. The moment of reckoning had arrived. "I'll handle the contacts," Ethan said. "You get the release out." Hayes gave him a brief nod of acknowledgement. They were ready. They had to be. As they moved to part ways, Ethan felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a battle, one that would define their lives, their careers, and their futures. But the truth was worth the fight, no matter what it cost. And so, with the weight of history on their shoulders, they set off in separate directions, determined to see this through. The truth was about to be unleashed, and no matter the consequences, they would make sure it was heard.